In this chapter, we're going to be setting up our Blender project. So go ahead and start a new file, and go ahead and delete everything in the scene. We don't need the cube, we don't need the light, and we don't need the camera. I'm going to go ahead and turn on my screencast C so you can see right down here whenever I press a keystroke. And then go up to Edit, Preferences, and here in the search bar, make sure you have Node Wrangler activated, as well as Loop Tools. And I'm going to go ahead and disable a few add-ons that aren't relevant to this course. And then you also need to enable Import Images as Planes. Now we're going to be using those three add-ons to help us later in the course. You can go ahead and close out of this window and we can bring in our reference image. So in the course material that I provided, you can go ahead and download that. And then you're going to want to navigate to it. And then just simply drag and drop it in. Before we drag and drop it in though, come back into your Blender project, press 1 on your number pad to go to front orthographic view, and then drag and drop it into the project. And then once you have the plane selected, press in on your keyboard, go up to item, and then simply just zero that out, 0, 0, 0, and it will be in the center of the scene. Then you can press G to move, and then Y to lock it to the Y-axis and move it back so it's out of our way. Alright, now we need to save this project, so just navigate to wherever you want it at. I'm going to call mine Katana course, and then save the Blender file. And that's it, we're done. In the next chapter, we're going to work on blocking out the blade. Alright, welcome to chapter 2. In this chapter, we're going to focus on the blade. Before we get started, let's go ahead and rename our reference image to reference image, and just drag that to the scene collection, and then rename this collection Katana. And now I also want to rotate this reference image by 90 degrees. If you're in front orthographic view, it'll automatically constrain it to the Z-axis when you rotate. So let's go ahead and move it up to match where our 3D cursor is in the center of the viewport, and rotate it just a little bit, about like so. Alright, now we're ready to begin working on the blade. We're going to start with a plane, but let's go ahead and ensure by pressing Shift-C that our 3D cursor is in the center of the viewport. This will ensure whatever we add is also in the center. So go ahead and press Shift-A and add in a plane. And then we're going to rotate this by 90 degrees along the X-axis. So you press R, 90, and then X. And then we're in object mode right now, but if we press Tab, we'll go into edit mode, and then we can scale this down. Scale it down to about so, and then hold down Z and go into wireframe mode. And then we can start lining this up. Just about like that. That looks good. So now if you double tap A, you'll deselect everything, and then you can press C, come into circle select, and just click and drag the vertices you'd like to select. Let's select these top two, and then drag these up to about there, and we'll also move it along the X-axis here to line up with our reference image. Now we're going to extrude these again by pressing E, dragging up about right there. We want to try to keep these pretty even, so be mindful of that. Alright, we're going to do the same. Just go up another about that long as your other segments, and rotate it just a little bit. And continue doing this all the way up the reference image. Now we can even move this in a little bit, as well as moving this one in just a little bit. And we will continue doing this until we're at right about here. That's where we'll stop. Now, I'm going to go ahead and add in a loop cut by pressing Ctrl R and then clicking, and then moving it to about there where it matches up with our image. And this is going to be the thickest part of the blade. On either side of this, it sort of tapers inward. This is the blade down here, and this is the top of the blade. Alright, so once we've got that, we can also add in another loop cut where our edge is going to be. Right about, I'd say there. Alright, let's focus in on our object by pressing delete on your numpad, and it'll focus it in the 3D scene. What I'm going to go ahead and do here is hop into top orthographic view by pressing 7 on the numpad, and making sure that I have this edge loop selected. You can do that by Alt and then right click on an edge. Come into top view here and just drag it out along the y-axis about right there. And then we can take this one and do the same, but this time let's go a little further. And then take this one and do the same, but not go quite as far as that we did with this one. And now we have a profile of about like this. We can go ahead and add in a mirror modifier and do that along the z-axis. And we can see the blade starting to take shape. Alright, now let's go ahead and block in the tip of our blade here. So we're going to just deselect everything by double tapping A, and then press C and come in and select these two vertices. And we're going to extrude these up to match the curvature of the blade and end at the point here. So holding down left control and then clicking, it'll automatically extrude out and also match the rotation that we want it to. So I'm going to go ahead and undo all that, and we can extrude it to about there. Let's see how many we need. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it took us 8 to get there. I'm going to go ahead and come into edge select mode by pressing 2. You can also do it up here. And select this edge and just double tap G to slide these down. Make them a little more even than what they are right now. Oh, gotta make sure to select the right edge. There we go. Awesome. And now we can select these two vertices and rotate them about like so to match a reference image. Just like that, we have the tip of the blade. So now we need to connect all this up in a way that makes sense and maintains good topology. So you wouldn't want to just start facing things up, because this creates an end-gon and it's going to have a lot of problems. What we're going to do is take this vertice right here and just also shift select this one to select both, and then press F to face those. And since we have, since we made 8 extrusions to get here, when we have 7 vertices that need a home, we need to press Ctrl R and add in 7 loop cuts here. Once you have 7, you can click and then right click to freeze where they are. And then come down here and select this edge and just start pressing F, and they will face themselves in. Now let's go ahead and do the same thing right here. Let's face that and add in 7 cuts and face those up, just like so. And there we go. We have our the tip of the blade. It's coming along quite nicely. And now what we can do is come into edge mode and alt right click this edge. And then we can extrude this, but before we do that, we need to enable clipping on our mirror modifier, so it'll weld together. I'll go ahead and show you what would happen without clipping. You see, these are not connected. If we turn clipping on, whatever vertices are in the center will be welded together to the other side. So with clipping on, let's go ahead and extrude this along the y-axis, and then press A to select everything, and then search for merge by distance, and then press enter. And you can see down here at the bottom, it removed 1 vertice successfully. Alright, looking good. Now we can come down here, and if you are ever having issues navigating your 3D space and things start to get slow and eventually stop moving altogether, you want to select a vertice or a face and then press delete on your numpad. Right next to the 0, and you'll focus in on that, and then you won't have any problems scrolling again. Let's go ahead and face all this in. Right now, well, let's think here. Let's just extrude this along the y-axis to where it meets the center there, and then select this edge, face it to that edge, and then face all that together. And there we go. We're done boxing out the low poly version of our blade. We'll go ahead and come up here in the outliner and just rename the plane to blade. Alright, in the next part, we're going to continue work on the blade and work on the Highpoly asset. Alright, welcome back. In this chapter, we're going to continue work on the blade. So let's go ahead and come in here, and I want to change the shape of of this curve right here. In fact, it isn't a curve right now. I want to make it a curve. So let's select that vertex and just double tap G, and we can use edge slide on all of these to sort of build out our own curvature. And just kind of make it slowly start curving in to the tip. And something about that I think looks pretty good. Now, let's go ahead and add in a bevel modifier and turn off clamp overlap, and it'll freak out. Let's change the offset to something pretty low, like 0.002, and bust the segments up to 3 and the profile to about 0.7. And then set smooth shading for the object. Let's go ahead and choose the limit method to weight, so only edges that we've given a bevel weight to have the bevel modifier applied. Let's go ahead and come in here, and I'll show you which edges need to be weighted. Anything on an exterior edge looks really good with the bevel modifier for this blade. So I'm just going to go into edge mode and then alt right click this edge here to select this whole edge loop, and come up here to in the in menu up to item, and then increase the mean bevel weight from 0 to 1. We're also going to do that for the tip right there and this edge loop as well, and also this edge loop as well. And then we're going to come down to the bottom, and all the edges down here are also going to receive the same treatment. So we can click on one, control right click, and it picks the shortest path in between them. And then we can just increase the bevel weight there. And just like that, the bevel modifier is only applied to the parts we want it to be applied to. Now we're going to come in and add in another modifier, a subdivision surface modifier. You can press Ctrl 2 on your keyboard with the object selected to hotkey it, and it'll add it in below the bevel modifier, which is important. If you added it in above the bevel modifier, basically it would do the sub D and then try to bevel that. And you don't want to do that because, well, let me go ahead and show you what sub D looks like. It adds in a lot of geometry that we're going to be using to bake in to the normal maps for our low poly version of the blade. But we don't want all that for this game asset. So let's move that below, and then select this outer edge here and increase the mean crease weight to 1. And basically, wherever the mean crease is, subdivisions will not happen on those edges. So it'll maintain its sharp aesthetic. All right. Now with that done, that's looking good for the beginnings of our high poly asset. Let's go ahead and Shift D to duplicate this, and right click to keep it in place, and rename the top one to blade underscore low poly, and this one here to blade underscore high poly. Let's go ahead and hide the high poly, and in the low poly we want to delete all these modifiers besides the mirror modifier, because we don't want to add all that extra information into the low poly version of the asset. We want to keep this pretty low. Right now we're at a 74 total verts for the blade. All right, now we can hide the low poly and come into the high poly and work on adding in some more details. Now this reference image here doesn't have what we're about to add in, but it is quite common for some katanas to have a sort of divot or groove going up the blade, so we're going to go ahead and add that in. So let's press Shift C to center our 3D cursor and add in a circle. And then down here we're given a menu. We can open that and change the vertices to something about 12. And then come in here and rotate that 90 degrees along the x-axis, and then rotate it by 15 degrees so it looks like a stop sign now. These two vertices down here need to be flat with one another. All right, let's go ahead and pull this up. Actually, we're going to start at the bottom of the blade here. So we're going to go ahead and pull it down, start scaling it down, and pull it out from the model along the y-axis. Scale it down a little bit more, come into front orthographic view, keep scaling it down, and we can start it about right here. Now we're going to go ahead and delete all these vertices here on the top, and we can just duplicate these, pull them up, scale along the z-axis, -1. And now we can pull this duplicate up here to the top where we want this groove to end. I think about right here would look good, and rotate it to fit in with these lines here. Now we gotta make sure these match one another. So what we're gonna do is add in a shrink wrap modifier so it's flush with this model right here. So let's create the target as the blade, and just like that, these vertices are now projected onto the face of that object. Let's go, before we apply that modifier, we want to make sure there's no distortion happening. You may have to move it around a little bit to get the effect you want. Let's come down here. All right, looking good. So we're going to go ahead and apply that. And then with our circle here selected, press Control right click on the blade, or no, sorry, Shift right click on the blade, and then on the Highpoly version of the blade, and then press Control J, and they will merge together. And just like that, they're now one and the same on the object, and all the modifiers that the blade had are now applied to the circle. You want to make sure you have the circle selected first before you join it to the blade, or it'll be the opposite, and the blade will lose all of its modifiers and inherit the ones on the circle, which we're done. All right. So now what we're going to do is select that vertex, come up here to the top, Shift right click on that one and face those together, and then do the same for the other side. Face those together. Yep, just like so. And we don't want it hanging off the edge here, so what we want to do is, let's see, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points it needs to match to follow the curvature of the blade. So on this edge we want to add in 5 cuts, which down here in the bottom left, as I do that, you can see the number of cuts we have, and then the same thing over here, add in 5 cuts, and then just right click to keep them in place. Then we can come into front orthographic and make sure we only have these 2 vertices selected, and simply move them into place, rotate them if needed. And we're going to do the same thing for all of these points. We're going to line them up with these other vertices. Make sure it follows the curvature of the blade. Just like so. Okay, that's looking good. So now, basically what we're going to do is we need to face these up into this face, so it's not just a bunch of vertices sitting on top of already existing faces. So we're going to add in 2 loop cuts here, and just simply right click to keep those in place. And let's go ahead and scroll up here to the top and see, here we've created an ingon. To fix that, what we want to do is select these 2 and then press merge at center. And that doesn't quite fix the problem of the ingon, but it doesn't really matter since it's on a flat surface. It's not going to affect any of our shading or textures. And since the tip of this won't be animated in and of itself, the entire object will be animated, it doesn't matter. Alright, let's go ahead and alt right click and select this edge and make sure we deselect these top 3 here. Come into front orthographic view, double tap G, and then slide it until it's past this vertex here, something about there. Do the same thing for this one. Make sure you deselect anything else up here it tries to select, and double tap G, drag it on over. Awesome. Now we're going to need to add in some more loop cuts to support this right here. So press Control R and pull that up about to where it matches with that vertex, and then add another one right about there and another one right about there. Now we're going to do the same thing for the bottom. And add one there, add one there, and add one there. And now we can come in and select these faces, starting with this one right here where this sort of intersects into it. We don't want to delete this one down here. and come up here to the top and control right click and delete those faces. Now we can start facing all this in. So select this vertex and join them together with F, and the same there, and then we can come into edge select, face those together, and then just hold down F and it'll actually face everything. So it's gone around the entire way and faced everything up. That's starting to look good. Now we can alt right click and select this entire edge loop, face it together, and it will create an N-gon, but that's okay, we'll delete it soon. And then come into front orthographic view and wireframe here, press I to inset. Give that an inset to about right there, and then do it again. And then we can move this along the y-axis to give it a little bit of depth. We don't want to go too crazy here, just a little bit to give it some detail. Okay, that didn't do what I wanted it to do. So yeah, something about like that, and then press I to inset it again. Hold on, let's make sure. Let's make sure we come into wireframe here and we can see what we're doing. Press I to inset that again, about like so. And then we can delete that N-gon. Come in here and select this top edge and hold down F and face all that in. So now we have a bunch of quads. And just like that, we've added in some pretty good looking detail to the blade. It's got this groove moving along the entirety of it. It matches the curvature. It's all quads. The topology's good. This will look really nice when it's baked onto our low poly asset. Alright, I'll see you in the next chapter. Alright, welcome back. In this subchapter, we're going to do one more thing to our blade before we move on. Let's go ahead and come into our low poly asset. Press tab. This is one thing I forgot to do. Let's select this vertex up here and come down to the bottom, select that one down there, and we're going to move this out a little bit along the x-axis to about right there, and do the same thing with this and match it up. In fact, let's just also go ahead and select that, and then bring that out to about there. Before we do that, we want to make sure we remember the value that we actually moved it. So up here in the top left, you can see it's about 0.005. So I'm going to type in 0.005, move that 0.005 units along the x-axis. And then since we changed the mesh on one version of our blade, we also have to do it on the other. So let's come into the Highpoly, select that there, and then G, and then X, and then 0.005. And there we go. It's given our blade a little bit more definition on this side, so we don't just have a flat edge. That'll help with some texturing later on down the road. And there we go. We're done with the blade for now. We can move on to some other parts of the katana in the next chapter. Alright, welcome back. In this chapter, we're going to block out the rest of the katana. So go ahead and press Shift-C to ensure that your 3D cursor is centered in the viewport. And we're going to add in a cube. We're going to make the RainGuard, which is this portion of the blade right here. Alright, let's go ahead and scale this down. Come into front orthographic view, continue scaling it down, get it to about right there, scale it along the y-axis. And I'm going to pop in the low poly version of the blade so we can look at that. Alright, something about like that. Let's make sure we're not. Okay, we're good on that. I actually just noticed a problem we have, at least a problem I have with my high poly blade. Let me look here. It's not present on the low poly, just the high poly. I didn't pull out these vertices like I should have. So I'm going to go ahead and fix that by turning on snapping to vertex and pull that along the x-axis and hover over that vertex to make that even. So there we go. I just didn't select all the way down in the last subchapter we did. All right, let's bring back in the low poly and the RainGuard. We're going to go ahead and call this RainGuard underscore low poly. And let's go ahead and add in a loop cut and line it up about right there with our blade. And then we can scale this along the y-axis a little bit to bring it out. And we can scale this along the y-axis to bring it in, as well as this one. And now if we add in a loop cut and pull it down here, and then instead of double tapping G, press G and then X, and it will maintain its curvature, bring it about right there. Actually, we're going to scale that out a little bit to about right there. Then we can Control B and bevel it, and it'll make that smooth. We can do the same thing here. Pull that in, maybe not that far, bevel that, and then we have a nice profile we can play with. And of course, we're going to shade this smooth later and give it some more geometry. Let's see, let's even bring this in a little bit, as well as this one, just a tad. Okay, yeah, I think that looks fine for the low poly. Let's go ahead and press Shift-C again to center our 3D cursor and add in a cylinder with 24 vertices. You can scale that down along the Z-axis, move it down, scale it down even more. And this is going to be our CrossGuard. We can set that about there. And then I want to add a loop cut on the side because we are going to delete in wireframe mode all of the bottom vertices and apply a mirror modifier along the Z-axis and turn on clipping. So we only have to model half of this. What I'm going to do is come into face mode, press I to inset, and come down as far as I can, but not passing the RainGuard. So something about like that right there, maybe just a little bit bigger than that. So I'll scale it back up. And now we can add in some loop cuts here. I think about 4 will do. And then we can come in, select that middle face, and turn on proportional editing up here. And then if we rotate along the x-axis, you can see that it's affecting the entire mesh, and you can scroll up and down to get a larger or smaller area of proportional editing. So I'm going to scale up to about there and rotate it just about like so. Then we can come in and right click, control click to select along the shortest path, and then shift click, control click, and just skip one. We're going to select every other row here as we go out until we've covered the entire thing. And then we can extrude down along the Z-axis and then delete all of those faces. And then if we select this outer edge loop here, let's just trying to, there we go. You have to all right click and hit it in the right spot sometimes. We can extrude this and then Alt S after we turn off proportional editing and bring it out about there, and then grab this edge loop, Alt S, and bring it out about there. And that is the low poly version of our CrossGuard done. So we can name it CrossGuard underscore low poly. And you see we've got this cool spiral effect going on pretty quickly and pretty easily. Now we can go ahead and add in, just Shift C again, add in our grip. So we're going to use a cylinder for this. 24 vertices is fine. We're going to scale it down, bring it up, and pull it down to about there. And we don't have to worry about the curvature right now. We're going to do that later. Probably with a Lattice modifier. Okay, we'll pull that up to sit inside just barely. And then we can scale it along the y-axis to about right there. And we can even come in here and shade smooth and kind of see the look we're going to have. Okay, well we've blocked out. We need to rename this guard underscore low poly. We've blocked out the rest of the katana, the low poly portions. We're going to work on the Unwrapping later when we work on the rest of the grip. And we're going to continue working on the Highpoly assets of the RainGuard and CrossGuard in the next chapter. Alright, welcome back to Chapter 5. In this chapter, we're going to focus on the Highpoly RainGuard and CrossGuard. Before we begin, I've tried recording this several times already, and I kept running into an issue with a bevel modifier we're going to work with later. And I just want to go ahead and say if you had any problems applying a bevel modifier to your blade, you need to make sure that you press Ctrl-A and apply specifically the scale transform, but it wouldn't hurt to apply all the transforms. I'll go ahead and show you on this RainGuard here the example of what I'm talking about. So let's press / on our numpad to isolate this, and we can go ahead and duplicate it, hide the low poly, and then rename the duplicate to Highpoly. Now we're going to add in a bevel modifier, but first let's go ahead and do a few things. Let's shade this smooth, and then come down here into the Object Data Properties panel and go to Normals, and then turn on Auto Smooth at 45 degrees. And then add in a bevel modifier. Let's do an offset of 0.002, segments of 3, turn off clamp overlap, put the profile to 0.7, put the outer miter type to arc, and the limit method to angle. And you can see we really don't have an effect here, but if we apply all transforms, now we do. So if you've been running into any issues with bevel modifiers, I'll try to add in a note on the earlier video, but if you still run into those issues, make sure you've applied the scale. That is very important, and it took me a while to figure out why this was messing up. And this is the thing about 3D modeling. This serves as an important lesson. You're going to run into issues, you don't know what's happening, you're following a video tutorial, or maybe you're not, and it takes some playing around with and tinkering with. You're going to run into hardships no matter how long you've been 3D modeling. And it's important to persevere, and eventually you figure it out. So awesome. We have a bevel modifier here now on our RainGuard Highpoly. Let's go ahead and add in a subsurf modifier of 2, and then let's add in some details. So let's add in a loop cut here and pull it up to about there, and then Control-B to bevel it. Make it about that big. And then press E, and then right-click to keep it in place, and then Alt-S to scale it along the normals. And bring it in to about, hold down Shift to get finer control. Bring it into about there. And you want to make sure you're not running into any beveling issues like we are a little bit here. You may have to play with the offset a little bit, increase it to maybe, not up. Let's try 0.001. That looks a little bit better. So that's looking good. Actually, I'm going to bump that up to about where we had it again, and then select this and scale it in just a little bit more. I do like that bevel profile. Alright, sweet. Now we've got, I don't know what you would call that, but I mean, I think it looks cool. And you can do that if you want even more. You could add another one down here, just the same way. Really easy way to add in some variation. I don't think it looks good down there, so I'm going to delete that. And really, that's all we're doing for the Highpoly version of the RainGuard. Later in the texturing process, we're going to add some markings here to make it interesting, something to look at. But that's it for now. Before we hop on over to the CrossGuard, let's come up to the blade and apply Auto Smooth as well. And we'll try an angle of 45. Let's come up here and see exactly what that did. So if we turn it off, we see there's a little more of a bevel on the edge. And if you don't, it's going to be a lot sharper. So I'm going to stick with the Auto Smooth because this is going to help us later when we're baking some normal maps. But it's kind of user preference at this point, up to you as the artist, so you can choose what you think looks best. Alright, let's come down to the CrossGuard and start working on the Highpoly version of that mesh. Alright, we're going to go ahead and apply a bevel modifier. Let's give it a similar offset of 0.002 and turn off clamp overlap. Turn the segments up to 3. Put that to arc and then angle 30. Let's go ahead and Control-A and apply all transforms. You can see it's already kind of really changed quite a lot. But since we had the mirror modifier applied, didn't quite do what we wanted since we were mirroring along the z-axis. Let's only apply scale. And yeah, that's the only one that really matters for this. And we're be mindful that we're still working on the low poly version of the CrossGuard. I'll duplicate this and then delete the modifiers later. Let's inset this face a little bit, and then inset it one more time, and then press M and merge at center, so all those shading issues go away. Then let's apply a subdivision surface modifier of 2. In fact, let's just make that 1 of 3. The more geometry we can get in there, the better. And look at that, it's really looking clean. It's really cleaned itself up quite a bit there. Let's scale that in a little bit, maybe. Yeah, about like that. Let's apply the scale again. You know what? I'm happy with the thickness of how it was. So, all right, and really that's it for the high poly version of the CrossGuard. We're going to add in a lot of detail in the texturing process, so we can go ahead and Shift D to duplicate that. Call it Highpoly, and then under the low poly, we can delete the bevel modifier and the subsurf modifier, and we're left with what we had, except for the new addition of these faces here in the center. And of course, we're using the mirror modifier, so it is applied to the other side as well. Alright, that's it for the high poly version of the CrossGuard and the RainGuard. In the next one, we're going to start working on the grip, and we'll probably add in another piece here pretty soon to connect this all together. I think it'll look better. Alright, I'll see you in the next one. Alright, welcome back. In this chapter, we're going to work on the grip and add in the Unwrapping. I'll show you what that is in a second. So, let's go ahead and rename our grip to Grip Low Poly. For some reason, I called it Guard Low Poly, which it's not a guard, so if that was confusing you earlier, I apologize. The Unwrapping is the Katana's signature wrap that goes around the wooden grip. So we're going to work on that right now. Let's go ahead and isolate everything else by pressing / on our key number pad there, and take this top face, Shift D to duplicate, press P to separate by selection, and then we can rename this Unwrap Low Poly. Alright, and now if we come into object mode and only select that, let's go ahead and delete, let's come into edit mode and delete these top vertices here. For some reason my screencast keys aren't on, so let me turn those on for you. Alright, there we go. And now we can come into object mode and pull that down to about there so we can work on it. Let's add in a mirror modifier along the y-axis there, and let's turn on clipping. Come into edit mode and then extrude down along the z-axis to about there. And we can edit all these values later. In fact, let's come down just a little bit further. Okay. Now let's select this vertice and this vertice and turn on proportional editing, and then scale it along the z-axis and move this in so you're only affecting these vertices right here. Select everything and scale it up a little bit more. Keep playing with this until we get a result about like so. Now let's come into object mode and add in a solidify modifier. Let's make the thickness about 0.05 and shade this smooth. And then add in a subdivision surface modifier with Control 2. Let's maybe make this a little bit thicker. We can play around with this thickness. If you click and drag on this and hold down Shift, you can really fine-tune the thickness. And if you start bringing it out, you'll notice that it sort of separates itself from the mesh. So let's turn the offset not to 0, but let's play around with it to where it doesn't separate itself too much, and we're still getting, we're not getting any clipping, and we're getting a result that we like. So something about there looks good to me for now. Now let's scale this up a little bit. Let's turn off proportional editing and scale this up just a little bit. And add in some loop cuts to help us define the edges of this wrap. Something about like that. Now let's come in and add in a array modifier. Okay, let's do a relative offset of -1. on the z-axis and then 0 on everything else. Let's drag this up to about right there for now, and then we can increase the counts just to run down the grip here to about there for now. We can kind of visualize what this is going to look like. And this specific auto wrap I have in mind to be kind of leathery. Some of them are more fabric, but I think leather would look pretty good. So I've included some reference images of auto wraps in the course material. You're free to look at those and maybe go your own way on this if you're feeling like it. Depends on what your game needs. This is a game asset after all, so we can make this more aggressive by scaling these in along the z-axis. But I want them to be pretty uniform, so let's think about what we want to do here. Let's come into wireframe and select these, turn back on proportional editing, and we can decrease our sphere of influence and see what this may look like. I think something like that looks pretty good. So let's go ahead and just move this up and keep that for now. Let's go ahead and at the top of the grip and the bottom, we're going to need a way to basically cap this off in a way that looks good and makes sense. So let's go ahead and Shift D to duplicate this, and we'll call this Auto Wrap End Low Poly. And we're going to join these together at the end, but for now, let's just keep them as separate objects and delete all the modifiers. Well, we can keep the Solidify modifier, and honestly the Subdivision Surface modifier we made. Let's just get rid of the array, and then deactivate Solidify and Subdivision Surface for now. And then we can come in here and scale, turn off proportional editing, and scale all of these to a value of 0 along the z-axis, so SZ0. Do this for all of these, and this will flatten all of them. And then let's turn back on our modifiers so we can visualize what we're seeing and add in the other part of the auto wrap. And we can move this up to where it matches about so. Alright, come into edit mode and we can Shift D to duplicate and drag this down to the bottom and also match it up to where it's touching. Okay. And now we can even come in on our grip and just simply extend the face to about the end there. We don't have to be exact because this won't be visible. It's just for our reference. Okay. And that's looking good. Let's go ahead and take our grip and shade it smooth. And then we'll duplicate it and start working with a higher poly version of... Actually, before we do that, let's... go ahead and select this face and then the face on the bottom, press I to inset. Actually, select them, press I to inset, bring it to about there, I to inset again, then select the top face individually, merge at center, and the same thing for the bottom, M, merge at center. And now we can duplicate it and rename the duplicate Highpoly. And then add in a Subdivision Surface modifier and add in some supporting edge loops on the top and bottom so it's flat about like so. Okay, that's looking good. Let's make sure we just apply scale on all these things we're working on. Oh. So you want to apply scale before you utilize the Solidify modifier. So let's see, this is a mistake I made. I'm going to keep it in just because I think it's important that you see mistakes are made during this process. So let's go ahead and delete the Solidify and the Subdivision modifier and turn off the Array modifier for now on both of these. Apply the scale there and there, and then come back in and add in a Solidify modifier and a Subdivision Surface modifier. And then play with the thickness, maybe about 0.007. Play with the offset just a little bit, bring it in so it hugs nicely. And then we're going to copy these values over to a Solidify modifier on the other one. Let's move the Array modifier to the bottom so it's out of our way. So we can just copy and paste these values for the thickness and offset onto this one, and then also add in another subdivision surface modifier. And then we can turn back on our array modifier. All right, looking good, looking good. That's the auto wrap done and told. I don't know if that made any sense, but we're done with it, sort of. We are going to mess with the thickness of the top and bottom pieces later. In fact, since we already have it flush at the bottom, we can just grab the top ones and then pull them down. It's not so important right now because we don't really know how thick they need to be or what looks good yet, but these values aren't set in stone, so we can mess with that later. Now let's go ahead and add in our pommel, the low poly version of that. So let's come in here to, let's come into the grip low poly. I'm going to isolate that from everything. And just select these faces and then press Control plus on your number pad to expand your selection. Oh. Expand your selection, Shift D to duplicate, and then P to separate by selection. If your cursor ever gets stuck in circle select mode, you just come up, hold down left click and go to tweak. That'll fix that. And then we can rename this pommel underscore low poly. Let's come into object mode and select only our pommel. And then we can shift, nope, we don't want to shift D. We want to, well first, let's go ahead and dissolve that edge. Actually, let's not dissolve that edge. Let's just simply extrude this down to about, let's bring back our reference image if we can. Yeah, we've extended past our reference image, which is fine, so we're just going to eyeball it for this. Let's isolate our grip and pommel. Come down here, extrude one more time, and then... Yeah, this is really causing issues down here, so let's dissolve. Let's delete that vertice and just face that with an N-gon for now. I also want to do that for the top. Just delete those vertices here, face that with an N-gon. We can worry about cleaning up the topology later. Alright, now let's come back in, grab our grip, and isolate those. And extrude this down and give it a bevel with Control B to get something about like that. Let's inset that and then press M to merge it center. Actually, let's inset that again and then M to merge it center. We're getting some shading issues here, but once we add in some modifiers, it should clean those up. Let's isolate this and come into face select, inset them, and set them again, merge it center. Now this is going to be our pommel, and in the texturing process we can really liven this up. And we're also going to add in some further details in another chapter and connect this up with our grip more. But now I actually do want to scale this pommel up a little bit, so let's go ahead and set the origin in object mode, origin to geometry, so the geometry isn't way up there. And then we can scale this out just a little bit along our axes, I guess would be plural, and bring down this end of the wrap here. We kind of want to make this flush with our wrap. At least look that way. It doesn't need to be exact, but it needs to look good. So something about like that I think looks pretty good. Now we can move this down here to about there. Let's go check the top. Looking good still. Awesome. Everything's looking good. So let's go ahead and select all of this in object mode. Move this down to about there. And then come in here and we're gonna do the same thing. We're gonna select these, Shift D, separate by selection. And for this, I don't really know what this would be called. We'll just call it connector low poly for lack of a better name. And then let's set the origin to the geometry. And we can come back in here and do the same thing we did actually in edit mode, where we delete this vertice, delete those vertices, and just fill that as a face. Now we can come in edit mode, scale that up. We can use snapping mode, so it'll snap to those vertices. Turn snapping mode off. Shade smooth. And now we need to work some magic to get all of our wraps to line up. So we want to bring this up to the top. Actually, let's come in edit mode and do it so we're not moving both the end and the front. And then let's scale this up again so it matches. And we're scaling along specific axes. Okay, that's looking pretty good. So in order to get this to fill correctly, we're either going to have to scale along the z-axis until it fits pretty well, which I actually think might be an acceptable solution here. So let's go ahead and do that. Otherwise, we could extend the grip. So here we actually need to scale it down to where it fits just like that. And I think that looks really good. Our katana is really starting to come together. We're going to continue adding more detail, of course. Let's go ahead and add some more detail and create the connector Highpoly. Before we do that though, I always get ahead of myself. Let's just face this up correctly. So we can press I to inset again, merge at center, do the same for the bottom, merge at center, and then we can duplicate this, call this connector Highpoly. Let's add in a bevel modifier to start this out. Let's make sure to apply the scale though. Turn off clamp overlap, turn the offset down to 0.002. Let's turn on auto smooth. Turn the segments up to 3, profile to 0.7, and the outer miter type to arc. And then add in well, let's also limit the method to angle so it's not beveling every angle we have, only angles that are at least 30 degrees. And then add in a subdivision surface modifier. And then we can also add a loop cut here, bevel it with one bevel, extrude and right click to keep in place, and then Alt S to scale down along the normals. And there we go, we've got some detail in that connector there. And that'll look pretty good in the after we texture it as well. So alright, I think that's all we're going to do for this chapter. In the next chapter, we're going to focus on the rest of, we're really just going to probably do another pass, add some more details down to this, connect it up in a way that looks good. Just do some more final passes on our mesh before we start the UV unwrapping process and everything that entails. I'll see you in the next chapter. Welcome back to Chapter 7. In this chapter, we're going to use a lattice modifier to deform our grip and all of these other pieces so they have a bit of curvature. But first, let's go ahead and work on some organization within our scene. Up here in the outliner, we have all of our objects just kind of thrown in here, and it's not very pleasing to the eye. So click on the Katana collection and then add in 2 new collections. We're going to call one low poly and then one high poly. Let's drag all of our high poly assets, make sure my screencast keys are on, into the high poly group, and then all of the low poly assets into the low poly group. Awesome. And now we can go ahead and hide all of those assets there, and we're going to work on everything from the connector down to the pommel. Let's come into our low poly grip and isolate that. And we need to add some supporting edge loops here so the lattice modifier can work properly. Let's add in about 5 of them. And then on the grip high poly as well, we need to add in about 5 of those. Let's see. All right, let's bring in the grip high poly, connector high poly, and then the grip low poly, connector low poly, the Unwrap end and Unwrap low poly, and then the pommel. Everything down here, high and low poly, we need in for this lattice modifier. So let's go ahead and press Shift-C and then add in a lattice modifier, and then drag it down and scale it along the x-axis to where it fits in just about there. And then we can scale it along the x-axis here. Sorry, we were scaling it along the z-axis in the beginning there. Okay, let's come into our lattice tab here and change the resolution up to 3, 3, and 3. Actually, let's change the W to about 8. And then we're going to select by holding down or pressing B and then selecting everything. We have all of our objects here. And then we're going to deselect the lattice modifier, select it again so it's the last selected, and press Control P and then do lattice deform. And that adds a lattice modifier to all of those objects at once. Let's just come in here to our lattice in edit mode, turn on proportional editing. Let's go ahead and bring in our reference image so we can kind of see the curvature. And grab these bottom vertices and increase our sphere of influence and just slightly bring it out like so. Something about there I think looks really good. Let's go ahead and hide our lattice modifier and then hide all of our, let's hide the grip, the connector, high poly, and check out the low poly assets. Those are looking good. Those are looking really good. It's actually I do want to change one thing on the lattice modifier. I think it might need some rotation here at the bottom. So let's just slightly rotate it to about there. Alright, looking good. Let's hide the lattice. I think that looks good. It's a nice subtle curve. It's not too extreme. Let's bring back everything so we can visualize what this will look like. I think that looks good. And you can play around with that lattice modifier to get whatever sort of curvature you want. You could have also done this on the blade in the beginning there. So that's another method of creating the blade if you just wanted to create a straight one and then use a lattice modifier to add in some smooth curvature. And lattice modifier is very powerful, and I encourage you to play around with it. So now let's go ahead and come in here to our Unwrap, and we need to work on a few things. Let's go ahead and apply the lattice modifier. Oh, no, we can't apply these yet. It's going to have to be the last thing that's applied. That's okay though. Let's go ahead and come in here and isolate that and apply the mirror modifier and the solidify modifier. And we need to decrease our overall poly count for this mesh. The wrap here is adding in a lot of geometry, and we want to reduce this wherever possible. So we're going to delete all the faces that we're not going to see in the final result. Let's go ahead and disable our subdivision surface modifier so we can see better. And then select this edge loop and press Ctrl+ in your numpad, and then delete all those interior faces. And that deleted about 50 or so, 54 vertices. And then with the array modifier, I mean, that'll add up quickly with everything we've added in. We can go ahead and turn back on the sub D modifier and do the same thing on the Unwrap end. So let's go ahead and apply the mirror and solidify modifier, disable the sub D, increase our selection, delete those, turn back on the sub D, and there we go. Let's go ahead and disable our sub D here and here and make sure only our low poly assets are in the scene. So right now we are at 6,346 tries, which is looking good. That's a good number to have. Before we deleted those interior faces, we were at about 8,000. So we got rid of about 1,600 to 2K tries and about 3,000 verts there. So that's good. So I'm looking around on the model right now, and I see that we have some intersection here. I'm not sure what caused that. This may only be on my end. I may have fat fingered a key. So I'm going to go ahead and fix that by isolating these two parts of the model disabling the lattice modifier for now, coming into edit mode on the end piece, and then selecting all of these and dragging down to about right there. And actually, that may have been due to when the sub D modifier was on, there being some discrepancies between the high poly and low poly, which can be a problem. So you do want to always double check by disabling any sub D modifiers you have and just making sure there's not any crazy intersection. There's actually a little bit up here too, so let's just go ahead and pull these up. You're always going to have to double check, because really you want it to line up in the low poly view most of all, because that's actually going to be the geometry used in the game asset. Okay, that's looking good. So that's everything for this chapter. I will see you in the next one. Welcome back, everyone. In this chapter, we're going to prepare a few things before we begin UV unwrapping in the next chapter. So first, I want to move this lattice modifier outside of the high poly collection into just the main scene collection. Because if you have it in a collection with objects it is parented to, those objects get thrown in under the lattice itself. I don't quite like how that looks. It's kind of confusing in some ways, so we'll move it down here, and it still contains a reference to each object that is parented to it. And then we can just minimize that right here. So there are a few things that I do want to change about the low poly mesh here after a day or two of thinking about it. For one, I want to delete the RainGuard and connector from the low poly collection, and then bring in the connector and RainGuard from the high poly collection and drag them into the low poly collection. And we can rename these low poly. The reason I'm doing this is because there's actually profile differences between the high poly and the low poly. Let's go ahead and delete these modifiers, and then I can show you exactly what I'm talking about. If we look at it from a side view or front view here, the profile indents inward. Previously on the low poly version, it was just flat. Where the profile changes, I like to keep the profile the same on the high poly and low poly for baking. Because where it changes so drastically like that in the high poly and the low poly is just flat, it can cause a lot of issues. Now, where that won't cause a problem is the blade, because whereas we do have some extra geometry here extruding inward, it's not affecting the profile or the silhouette of the blade. So let's go ahead and hide our high poly assets and come in here back to the low poly. Now we have a few things here in our low poly collection that aren't in our high poly because we haven't duplicated them over yet, such as the auto wrap and the auto wrap end and the pommel. So let's go ahead and Shift D to duplicate that and drag those down to our high poly collection, and then we can rename them high poly appropriately. Also, I want to ensure that everything has a uniform scale of 1. So let's just select everything, Control A, and apply the scale. And then do the same thing for the high poly collection. Select everything, Control A, and apply the scale. I have just noticed an error we have going on here with the high poly version of the grip. So since we know the low poly is good, instead of trying to line that back up, let's just delete the high poly and then duplicate in the low poly. I'm not really sure where that discrepancy came from. On your end, it may be fine. I probably, again, fat-fingered something earlier in the process. So we'll call that grip high poly, isolate it, and then give it a sub D modifier above the lattice modifier, and we'll just add in some edge loops here to make those edges a little more crisp. Let's go ahead and add a subdivision surface modifier to the pommel. And I am noticing a discrepancy here. So let's pull this down. First of all, we can set the origin of this object. So it's actually, the origin is inside the geometry. And let's line this up a little better and duplicate it bring it over to our low poly collection, delete our pommel low poly, and rename that duplicate low poly. That fits a whole lot better. Now we can delete that sub D modifier on the low poly, that is. This stage, I'm really just inspecting the mesh, making sure everything is up to par, everything looks good and it's in place properly before we start UV mapping everything. Alright, everything's looking good. That's all for this chapter. In the next chapter, we're going to begin the UV mapping process. Welcome back to everyone's most favorite chapter, UV unwrapping. No, I'm just kidding. Everyone hates this for some reason, and sometimes it can be a little frustrating and rage-inducing, but we're going to get through it together and hopefully it won't be that bad. Let's start in the Highpoly collection and unwrap the Unwrap Highpoly. So let's come into the UV editing layout. For some reason, I've already got some UVs already laid out here. You may or may not, but that's okay because we're not going to use these at all. Let's go ahead and come in here and Alt-right click. Well, let me turn my screencast keys on. Alt-right click there and there, and really just all the way down here on each auto-wrap object, all the way down to the bottom, and then Control-E and mark seam. Now if we give this an unwrap, we're going to get a result that looks like this. Now if you're not seeing this blue overlap here, this blue display, you need to press in, go into View, and then turn on Stretching. You'll probably have an initial view that looks like this. Just turn on Stretching, and we're aiming for dark to light blue here. The darker the better. But if you're having any greens or oranges or yellows or reds, that means you have a lot of stretching going on. And stretching is a no-no. We want to avoid that at all costs. Otherwise, the textures are going to look all stretched and horrible. So this is looking real good right here. So we're done with the auto wrap for now. Now we can come into the auto wrap end and do something very similar. Just select that edge and mark a seam and then unwrap, and we have a very similar result. So that's good right there. Now let's come in and work on the pommel. So right now we are having a lot of stretching here. We don't want to see colors like that. Let's select this top edge loop and mark a seam there, and perhaps one right about there, mark a seam there. Do an unwrap and see what this looks like. It's not quite looking like how I would like it to, so let's add another seam here from that edge to that edge, mark a seam and see what it looks like. That's looking a whole lot better. So basically, it's taking this series of edge loops all the way around, all the way up to here, and that's what these are. That's what that selection is, that UV island. And then it has one of these spheres is down here, and then one of these spheres is up here. If you were to add in a seam across the entire edge loop, you would get a result that looks about like that. And that looks fine too, but that's a lot of seams, and that could be visible. So you want to keep seams down to a minimum, so there aren't too many seams in the textures, but you also want to avoid stretching. And you want to strategically place them in places that hopefully go pretty unnoticed. So I'm going to go ahead and clear this seam and try moving it down even more, maybe another one, and add another seam there, and just see what this looks like. Okay, I'm quite liking that. The seam may be less visible down there. Alright, let's come into our connector. Add in an edge loop at the top, right there. Mark those seams, and then maybe these edges right there. Let's see what that looks like. That's looking good. We're getting a little bit in here, so let's come in, make sure we have UV sync selection turned on, come into face select mode, and select one of these lighter faces and see where the stretching is occurring. So it looks like the stretching is occurring on the other side. So if we add in another seam here, Yeah, that's helped a little bit. There's still a little bit of stretching, but since these are on these faces, I mean, these aren't going to be visible faces at all, and that's not too much stretching, so that is an acceptable concession in my mind. We'll go ahead and keep it there for now. Let's come into our grip itself, work on UV unwrapping this. So we'll add an edge loop there and there, mark the seam, and then another one along the side. Just do it right there. Let's make sure we're on the same edge. I believe it's that one. Yes, it is. Mark the seam and then unwrap. And we're left with a very similar result as to what it just automatically gives you, which is fine. That's what we want. There's not any stretching going on in this one, so that looks good. Now let's come into our CrossGuard and add a seam going along this edge loop. Let's go ahead and give that an unwrap. Let's take a look at it. So this would be good, actually, if it wasn't for all this green and this stretching. So we're going to add edge loops around every cutout we have. You want to make sure you're only selecting those edges. Sometimes it's helpful to even disable these bevel and subdivision surface modifiers while you do this, so you can see exactly what edges you're selecting. And go ahead and select all of these and add a seam around them. Alright, once you've added a seam to all those, go ahead and give it another unwrap and you'll have a result looking about like this. Now there's still a lot of stretching going on in these interior faces. I went ahead into Substance Painter and baked this to see how it would look, and the result looks fine. So we're going to keep this as is and move on to the next part, which is the RainGuard. So let's go ahead and add in seams along these bottom edges. A seam there, and there, and then a seam along these top edges. Give that an unwrap and see what it looks like, and that looks horrible. So let's go ahead and add in maybe an edge loop there and mark a seam and unwrap it there. And that looks alright. There's a little bit of stretching, but again, these are probably going to be, some vertical faces there. Okay, so that's good. We added in an edge loop and then marked that as a seam to basically just cut it down the middle. Now we're going to come into our blade, Highpoly, and we're going to add a seam along this entire exterior edge loop. Mark a seam and then unwrap. And then we also want to add in seams down here. Mark a seam there. And then we're going to add a seam around this edge loop right here. We get a result that looks about like that. Now there's something to note here. If you want to have details on both sides of the blades that are unique from one another, you have to apply the mirror modifier before you unwrap. Otherwise, basically this UV unwrap is going to be for both sides, so both sides will be identical. So I'm going to go ahead and apply the mirror modifier and then unwrap it here so we can have unique details along both sides. I'm going to go ahead and drag this up out of this UV window. This is called our 0-1 space. Anything inside this is basically where we're defining what textures will be applied to where. Now I believe we have everything UV unwrapped. So let's take everything and independently just drag it somewhere outside of here so we can start combining them in a way that makes sense. Just pull that over there, pull that there. All right, now let's select everything and see what else we have. So this is, let's go into face select and press L. This is the connector. Let's drag the connector over there. Let's go ahead and hide our reference image from the scene. We don't need it right now. Now everything has its own place. So let's start dragging things back in. Now the blade, we want to have a lot of real estate in our UV 0 to 1 space because it's going to be one of the most detailed parts of the model. So we're going to just move it diagonally here and scale it up a bit. And then here we have these end pieces. We can just select those with L and rotate them, give them a home. Let's scale them up a little bit and give them a home about right there. Oh, let's come back in and select everything again. And we also want to give our auto wrap a decent amount of space as well. And this is our auto wrap end piece, so we're going to move these to be side by side. Let's give it as much as we can. So something about like that. We don't want to get too close to these, otherwise we may have some texture overlap. Something about there is good. Now for our grip, well, I keep on isolating things. We want to have everything selected. Come into edit mode. So for our grip, let's scale this down quite a bit. It's going to be mostly occluded by the wrap. And move that to about right there. We can take these and even scale these up just a little bit. Let's see. And I keep doing that. All right, you want to stay in this view. Actually, let's come into our CrossGuard and move that down here so it's not overlapping anything. Let's move our CrossGuard details, our UVs up here. Scale it down. We want to give our CrossGuard a decent amount of texture space as well. So something about like that. Then we can come in and select all of these guys with L. Let's just select those 4 for now. Well, actually, let's move those up there. Select these guys. Kind of get them all in a row. There we go. Now we're going to select all these and scale them down uniformly so they all have the same size. And just start fitting them in where we can. This is probably one of the areas, or some of the UVs with the least priority in terms of size. These are not going to be very detailed in those or even large in those interior faces there. We still want to make sure that they're nice and they have a home, but these are the ones I would sacrifice first if, you know, I had to make a sacrifice. Let's move those up here, and these 2 guys down here for now. We can always move these later if we find the UVs aren't working out. This should be our pommel, yep. Let's scale these down and up, and we'll fit those in right there. Let's see, what is this? This is our connector, so this is also kind of a low priority, so we can scale this down and squeeze that in at the end. This is our RainGuard, which I do want to give enough texture space. So we really do need to find this a home. I'm going to have to rethink about how I fit some of this in here. We could put it right there or right here. I think we're going to put it right there. So we're going to come in here to the grip and scale this down just a little bit and move it up and move these above it. And now we've got all this space to fit this in here. Let's get it as big as we can without getting it too close to anything. And come in here with our pommel. And we may have to separate these a little bit. So we'll take these guys, scale them down, fit them in right there, and take this guy, scale it down just a little bit, and put it right there. And there we go. We have our Highpoly model, UV unwrapped. Everything has a home. I think this is going to work out really nicely. So instead of redoing all that work for the low poly version, we'll only have to redo a little bit of it, mainly the blade. Everything else we should be able to simply copy and paste over. So let's come into our low poly collection, and really we're going to delete everything. So it's gone. Come into our, besides the blade, come in here to our high poly, duplicate everything, drag it into the low poly, and we're going to rename everything low poly again. To save some time, we can copy and paste that underscore low poly. Just come in here, start pasting it in. Alternatively, you could have started with the low poly and then done this, but then you'd have to apply all those modifiers again. So let's go ahead and delete all of these modifiers that we don't want. Subdivision surfaces, bevels, keep the mirror modifiers. Oh, I want to delete the subdivision surface too, the bevel, sub D. All right, that's all gone. Need to do it on the connector as well. And that's looking good. And as well, also on the grip. Now let's come into UV editing window again and go ahead and mark a seam for our blade and unwrap it. We also want to do it along the bottom here. There we go. Now we'll move that out. Bring everything else back in. Let's go ahead and apply the mirror modifier on our blade. And then give it another unwrap. Select everything. And now we can just take our blade and fit it into this already existing slot. Scale it up as much as we can afford. Take these guys, turn on face select, take these guys, move them down here and scale them up just a little bit. And there we go, we're done with the UV unwrapping process. That wasn't too painful now, was it? So now we can move on in the next chapter, getting ready to export out to Substance Painter. Welcome back. In this chapter, we're going to work on our ID maps, we're going to create a cage, and we're going to clean up the mesh a little bit. So let's start with the mesh and come into our Unwrap Highpoly and come into edit mode and double tap A to select everything and then merge by distance. We have a lot of duplicate vertices sitting on top of each other, so that'll help a little bit. Let's come into the low poly and do the exact same thing. Merge by distance. It removes 260 vertices from both counts. And then let us select everything in the low poly collection and come into edit mode, select everything, and recalculate the normals. And then let us do the same thing on the high poly version of the blade. Select everything, recalculate normals. We want to make sure all of our normals are facing the right way. Let's come into the high poly portion of the blade and start doing something called ID mapping with vertex painting. This is going to allow us to apply certain textures to certain parts of the mesh in Substance Painter. So select the blade high poly to start, go to vertex paint, and then come up here to this color palette and pick a color. Any color, it doesn't really matter. And then press Shift and K and it will apply that color to all those vertices of the blade object. Come back into object mode and it'll disappear. Now it's important that if you want to share any materials and that you know ahead of time you want to share, to basically remember this hex value or write it down or copy and paste it so you can use that same color on different objects. I'm not going to be doing that though, except for the auto wrap, and I'll show you how I do that. Now let's come into the RainGuard, do the same thing. Let's pick a yellowish color, press Shift K, come back into object mode, come into the CrossGuard, pick a pink color. Doesn't really matter what these colors are, they just need to be different. In fact, they could be different by such a small value, super small, but I like opposing colors, so it's just a contrast. I guess you can easily see they're different. So now for here, we want to come in on the auto wrap end and let's pick a brownish color, apply it there, and then just come into the auto wrap and just press Shift K and we'll use the exact same color for those. Now let's select the grip high poly, come into vertex paint and make an even darker brown for that one. Now for the pommel, we'll just select oh, I don't know, a red. And we'll pop that on there. So now we have our ID maps created, and I'll show you how to bake those in once we get into the Substance Painter part of this course. Now we need to build our cage. And essentially what a cage is a mesh that is slightly bigger than our low poly mesh that defines the bounds of where light will bake into the normal maps. Now I'm going to show you, and once we really get into it, you'll understand how it works. But let me go ahead and hide everything, and I'll actually just make a little explanation here. So let's create a cube, and let's say this is our low poly mesh. We'll duplicate it, and we'll hide that cube. And let's say this is our high poly mesh with some bevels. Let's duplicate the low poly cube again. You don't have to do any of this, you can just watch, and slightly scale it up to be slightly larger than the low poly cube. Whenever we're baking our information in Substance Painter, it'll use the cage to define the parameters, basically the out of bounds limit. Anything inside the cube is where the light will be restrained to. So this really helps in the baking process. You can try to do it without it, and you really have to, at least with this specific model, it's really finicky. And this may change on a per model basis on how useful it is, but I found for this katana it is extremely useful. So let's go ahead and duplicate all of the low poly assets and bump them into their own collection. And then just hide the low poly and high poly. We'll call this cage. Let's make sure we apply all the modifiers that are pending here. Once we've done that, we can select all these objects and press Ctrl J to join them. Make sure we shade the object flat, we don't need any shading for this, and recalculate the normals so we can make sure all the normals are facing the correct direction. Then we can rename this object cage. Now we want to bring back in the low poly and select the cage and press Alt S to scale along the normals. Let's do this in edit mode. And we just need to do it just a little bit, so maybe just something like that. When we come into wireframe mode, and we can see it is slightly larger. I'm going to make it just a little bit larger. Something right about there. Okay, so now we can go ahead and export out this cage as an FBX. So select the cage, go up to File, Export, FBX. And then navigate to a place where you want to export it to. I'm going to go to Documents, Udemy, Katana course, and I will call this cage.fbx. Now we're going to limit this to only the objects we have selected and the object types to mesh. We're going to keep all these settings the same. Come into Geometry, make sure Apply Modifiers is checked. We don't have any modifiers right now. And then you can go ahead and export that as an FBX. Now we can hide the cage and come into the low poly and select all of our objects. Now we can go Export FBX. We'll call this Katana LP for low poly, and make sure that Apply Modifiers is turned on. And we can do the same thing for the high poly. Select everything, export, FBX. We'll call this Katana High Poly. And we'll export that as an FBX. And this may take a second since it has so much more geometry. Alright, that concludes the Blender part of the course. Now we can move into Substance Painter in the next chapter and begin baking in our normal maps and then move on to texturing the katana. Welcome back everyone to the next chapter, the next section of this course. We're going into Substance Painter. I'm super excited to be in Substance Painter. I love texturing models. It's when you can truly, I think, be creative and breathe life into the 3D model that you've made. It's amazing. I love it. Oh man, I just love it. Okay, let's get going. Let's go up to File and then New. And here on the File type, select and bring in the Katana low poly FBX that we exported from Blender. For the document resolution, use 4096. We're going to make this a 4K texture set, and then press OK. And here we go. First, we want to start by examining our model and making sure all of the normals are facing in the right direction. If anything looks half invisible or you can see through some faces, you need to go recalculate your normals back in Blender and re-export. But everything's looking good here. So now we can go to texture set settings and go to bake mesh maps, and we can begin baking in all of our high poly information. Let's go ahead and uncheck ambient occlusion because we're going to do that after we bake all of this. So for the output size, let's pick 4096, and then for our high definition mesh, let's choose the Katana high poly. We're going to use a cage since we created a cage. If we had not created a cage, we would need to mess with the max frontal and max rear distances. And if you don't want to use a cage, you can play around with those values. You're really just going to have to troubleshoot it and see what works and what doesn't. Typically, I go for low values like 0.0001. But let's go ahead and tick use cage and then bring in our cage.fbx. Now let's scroll down here and all of that looks good. Feel free to turn on some 2x2 or 4x4 or even 8x8 anti-aliasing. I'm going to go ahead and check that. You don't have to. I haven't, in my test, turned it on at all and it looks fine. But I'm going to go ahead and turn it on. Come down here to our ID mesh map and make sure the color source is set to vertex color, since that's how we apply the UV maps. And then go ahead and bake the mesh maps. This may take a minute depending on your computer, but I'll get back to you once it's done. Alright, we're done. So we can press OK, and then let's come back into Bake Mesh Maps and uncheck everything besides Ambient Occlusion. And the thing we're going to change here is we're going to bump up the min occluder distance all the way to 0.1, and then use low poly mesh as high poly mesh. Let's go ahead and bake that. Alright, that's done baking. Now we can take a look at all the nice information that's come in here. It's really transformed what's going on with all this baking. It looks so much better. We can see the detail from our blade that previously wasn't there, and just all the curvature this low poly model now has in its texture sets. Alright, let's go ahead and save this as, I'm going to save mine as Katana Course, and save it somewhere that you won't delete it. And in the next chapter, we can begin texturing everything. Now, I am going to be using some smart materials, and we're going to make some materials from scratch. Substance Painter has a lot of smart materials out of the box, but there's this website called substance3d.com, share.substance3d.com, Substance Share. And people create brushes, filters, smart materials, smart masks, all these cool things, and they share them for free. So this is a great website you can go on and browse around and maybe find something you want to add in for a future project or even this project. I'm going to include every single smart material I use in the course material, so you can go ahead and download that and move it into your Substance Painter directory. Welcome back. In this chapter, I'm going to show you how to import smart materials into Substance Painter. So navigate to your course directory, your course materials. If you want to bring in the ones I have given you, we'll go ahead and just do this leather stylized. Drag and drop it into the shelf in Substance Painter, and you get a window that says import, and it asks what type of resource it is. It actually automatically detects that it's a smart material. And then you can just either import it into the current session, the project, or the shelf. I would do the main shelf and press import. And that's it. That's how you import them in. Fairly easy. So in the next chapter, we can start texturing. Welcome back. We're going to start texturing the blade first in this chapter. So let's go ahead and create a new fill layer. Just delete that other layer, and we'll call this albedo. It just means base color. We'll create a folder and then drag it into that, and we'll call this blade. Now here, under the color properties, we can tweak the color, maybe put it a little darker, and bump the metallic up to 1. And then for now, let's bring the roughness down to about there, and we can tweak that later. Now let's right-click on this and add a black mask. And then up here under Add Effects, we can add a color selection. And this is where our ID map is going to come into play. So now we can press pick color and then just click on the blade. And now this material, everything inside under albedo there is applied to only those polygons and those vertices. Let's actually delete that and delete that mask and move it up to the folder at a black mask. And then let's see, add color selection, pick the color, and now anything in this folder will only be applied to here. Awesome. Now let's go ahead and create, we'll just duplicate the albedo layer and then call this one edgeware. And let's only bring over, we don't want metallic, we don't want color. Yeah, we do want color. Okay, so we'll get rid of the metallic because we're not going to change that. Let's bump this up to be a slightly brighter color, just very slightly, and then bump the roughness up a little bit. Now if we create a black mask for this, we can right click on the mask and then add in a generator. And Substance Painter already has a built-in metal edgeware generator that we can utilize. And just like that, it detects where the edges are and it actually is adding in that color and any other properties we tell it to. So let's increase the height just a little bit. Actually, let's decrease the height just a little bit because edgeware would be chipping away at the blade. Let's see, let's maybe do it to a 0.005. Let's see what that looks like. That is way too much. 0.0005 perhaps. Yeah, that's looking good. And then we can also play with these colors and the overall metallic value. Let's come back down to the albedo and bump up the roughness of the overall blade. Actually, let's bring it to a 0.9 for now. And this one to a 0.15. We'll keep that there for now and we may tweak that later. Now let's go ahead and add in some, let's see what some dirt could potentially look like. So if we add another fill layer, and this one we're not going to change the metallic value either. We can play with our color wheels here until we get a dark, well, we actually do want to change the metallic value here because the metallic value on the dirt is going to be 0. It's going to have no metallicness to it. We'll call this dirt. And then we will add in a black mask to that and a generator. And there should be a dirt generator here. There is. And it's kind of a lot, so let's bring this dirt level and the generator properties way down. Let's scroll a little bit out here so we can see the overall effect it's having. The dirt contrast, we can increase and decrease. Tweak the grunge amount. Give it less or more grunge. Make it really grungy if we want to. Grunge scale. Default value is fine. I'm going to tweak it up to 6 for now. And you just kind of play around with these values until you get someone you like. Let's come into the dirt and increase the height slightly on this because dirt would be sitting off of the blade. Let's come back in here and bring the dirt level down. We don't want a ton of it. And the cool thing about this is it's all procedural. So far we haven't done anything by hand. Just kind of playing around with the values here. Yeah, that's looking real good. Let's make a new layer. Bring that into our blade collection, move it above the dirt. And we're going to call this Engravings. Now in the course material I provided some alphas. Here I'm going to use the Japanese symbol for music. And I picked this one, and you can create your own alphas in Photoshop if you don't like these. I don't know, because I have a music and harmony alpha. And I don't know, I just think it kind of fits. The music of the blade, the harmony, I don't know. I just looked for some cool Japanese symbols, to be honest. Now, if we paint those there, what we can do is if we grab the harmony alpha and we come in and paint it on the other side, we can come into the engravings. If I can, now let's undo that and actually create a fill layer and call it engravings, and then add in a black mask and then do that again. So bring in harmony, put harmony there, and music right back here in about the same spot. Now we can come into the engravings panel here, and I don't want to bring in color or metallic or roughness, but I do want to affect the normals and the height. So if we decrease the height, and that'll be engraved into the blade. And you could, go up the entire blade if you wanted to with cool markings. You could just keep painting these, grab other ones. I have a couple other alphas I've thrown in the pack that we're going to use down here. But we also want to do something else. We want to give this on the black mask an anchor point. And we'll just call it engravings mask. And then under metal edge wear, we want to come down and make sure we have, under micro details, micro normal to true. And then come down to the micro height. Let's drag that under there. And then under micro normal, make sure we're using the engravings mask. And that will apply the edge wear generator to the engravings as well. And we can also do this with the dirt. We'll add in an anchor point and make sure under micro details we're using micro normal. And that'll ensure that basically these generators are also affecting that. It's a really cool way to add engravings and keep detail. It's really, really cool. We could even take this a step further if we wanted to, and also add in, under texture set settings, add another channel, an emissive channel, and then come in to the engravings and give it an emissive value of, let's say if you wanted this to sort of emanate power, have it be like magical runes inscribed in the katana, you could have an emissive value here, and then in Unreal Engine or Unity or Blender, you can crank up this emissive power to be really, really cool and have it sort of have glare and be glowing. You could even animate it. But for this, we're not going to be doing any of that. We're just going to disable the emissive value there and keep it as is. Sort of be a little more realistic with this blade. And I'm not really digging the amount of metallic we have in, or the amount of roughness we have in right now. So I'm going to decrease the roughness, increase it to 0.2, and then under edge wear, make sure we're a little higher than that. And under dirt as well. Yeah, we're pretty good on the dirt. And for now, that's going to be it we're going to do on the blade. We're going to come back to this later perhaps and tweak it as we start fleshing out the rest of the textures. We can see how it sort of works with everything else. I'll see you in the next chapter. All right, welcome back. In this chapter, we're going to work on the RainGuard and the CrossGuard, perhaps the connector as well. So we're going to add in a smart material for this, and if you don't have the bronze armor smart material, I've included it in the course material, and you can import it like I showed you. Let's go ahead and just drag it out and hold down left control when we do so, and we can apply it to the CrossGuard. And then with this bronze armor folder selected, we can also drag it to the RainGuard, as well as I want it on the connector. And then I also want it on the pommel. So there we go. We've got, it's just added all these selections to the black mask here. Now we can start playing around with some of these values. So for the base metal, we can change really everything. Let's change the color to make this a kind of a blackish blue. It's got a tint of kind of a dark blue, but it's still pretty black. Pull it up just a little bit, put it right about there. Then under the mask editor for the edges damage, we can tweak the global balance. I really like it right there around 0.4. I really love this this look. I think it fits in really well, especially once we have everything else on there. It's going to look really good. Check down here at the pommel. Not really crazy about how the pommel's looking, so I'm almost tempted to delete that color selection and add it back in under Effects, Add Color Selection, and pick our colors, pick that one, and that one again. And then we can create a separate smart material group for the pommel. We'll go ahead and do that. We'll just select our blade and then bring out the bronze armor smart material again, apply it there, and it'll create a new folder with a new mask. And we can tweak these individually. So let's come back to our other one. We'll call this the guards, and then this one the pommel. So under our guards here, let's make sure we copy that hex value. And there's a way to do that, and the way we're going to do that is come down to, I want to invert it. So for edges damage, I want the base color to match the base metal for up here, and that way the edges are going to be that dark blue instead of vice versa how it is in the cards. So now we come into our edges damages mask editor. We can play with these values. I think something like that's looking good. You can also play with the filtering mode. See what looks best. I really think what it was on to begin with does look the best, which is linear dodge. Let's come into the dirt. I don't really see any of the dirt being applied. Let's change the color of it. Okay, yeah, there's a little bit of it happening. We'll change this to more of a brownish color. Just a little bit of it right there. Yeah, add a little bit more in. Alright, that's looking good. That's looking good. We can add in some engravings down here as well. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's come in here down to our alphas and scroll down. I think I want to use this flower right here, or maybe this one down here on the pommel. So let's make sure we're in our pommel. We are. Let's create a new fill layer and move it right above the base metal. We don't want to change the color, the emissive value, the metallic. We just want to really change the height. So let's add a black mask to that. And then under the black mask, we'll take this flower decal, we'll scale it down, and make sure that under the material properties, we change the height to be in the negative somewhere. Or we could even make it positive. We could make it extruding outward. In fact, I kind of like that. So let's go ahead and clear that mask. Fat fingered it. See what this one looks like. Yeah, I like that one right there. Maybe this one. Ooh, that one's looking good too. All these look pretty decent. I think I'm going to use that one. So if we hold down left control and then left mouse button up and down, we can rotate our mask to get it to be straight here. Let's rotate it to where it is straight, something about like that. And then come in on the other side. Need to rotate it again. Put one about right there. See what they could look like potentially on the edges here. I don't really like the look of that. Then we come in and just call this flower engravings and add a anchor point. Then here on the mask generator for the dirt, make sure we're using micro details, micro normals, come down to micro height and do the flower engravings. Oh yeah, also on the micro normals there. And there we go, we can see the dirt being applied to that. Let's also come up to the edges damages and do the same thing. Flower engravings. Micro details, micro normal. Ooh, that's looking kind of intense. Let's come in here and decrease the global balance. It's kind of a lot. There we go. Now if we come into our flower engravings, we can increase the height if we feel like we need to, or even decrease it. I think something about 0.1 is looking good. There we go. I think that looks really good. I mean, that's just that's mimicking 3D detail in a 2D space. Looking good. Now, in the guards, we're also going to add in some engravings. So if we come into guards, create a fill layer just like we have been. Bring it right above the base metal. Call this engravings. Add a black mask, and then we don't want to change, again, the color, the metal, the roughness, or the emissive, just the height values. And you can use the Daisho alphas. I hope I said that right. Daisho, it means something. And what it means is, I'm probably going to butcher this, but in the Japanese samurai culture, the Daisho engraving stands for big little. And it's basically represents a set of katanas that samurais would use. And the Daisho katanas, it literally just means big little. One katana would be big, and then there's smaller ones. Now, and that's, again, I just think they look cool and they add something, so we're not going to get too far into like the detail and if it actually sort of makes sense historically, but it probably doesn't. If you want those sort of things, feel free to make your own alphas and add in your own sort of historical meaning. I just think they look cool, so sue me, I guess. All right, let's come in here before we apply that and change the height and decrease that. Put that one there, and then we can use the other Daisho on the other side and put that there. Maybe a little bit. Yeah, right there. Now let's add in an anchor point. And under surface details, or where were we? Yeah, surface, or no, the dirt. We want to use the mask editor here to have a micro height of, well, let's rename this anchor point to RainGuard Engravings Mask so we can differentiate. Under the mask editor, make sure we have RainGuard Engravings Masks. Just like that. And we're... Okay, that was the dirt, so let's also do that for the edges. And make sure under micro details, we turn on micro normals. And do that for the dirt as well. I don't think I did. Let's come back into the edges mask generator, and under micro details, let's play with the curvature intensity, the height details intensity. That's not really doing anything. Not what I was planning. Alright, so I figured it out again. We're gonna, under the engravings on the RainGuard, remove the height value. And I like the look of this a whole lot better. This is actually what I was going for, and I was like, why isn't this working? So you gotta play around with it. Yeah, if you get rid of that height value, it just sort of almost like paints it on there. I think it's really cool how it doesn't even really include the whole thing. I don't know. It's cool. It's a cool effect. I like it. So that's it for this chapter. We've done the RainGuard, the CrossGuard, the connector there, and the pommel. In the next chapter, we're going to work on the rest. All right, welcome back. In this chapter, let's start off by working on the wood grip. So in our smart materials here, and in the course material, I provided a wood walnut material. If you don't already have it, feel free to import it from the course material. Hold down left control and apply it to the grip there. And we're going to keep it like that for now until we can visualize how it will look with the auto wrapping. So we'll just rename this to grip. And then let's come and grab a leather stylized material and apply that to the auto wrap. You can kind of see how the katana has come together, and I think it's looking really good. We're going to make it look a little better here though. So let's go ahead and under leather stylized, we'll just call this wrap and come down to the base color. Let's change it. I want it to be more of a reddish black. Something kind of like that, just a dark red. And then for the curvature, we're going to pick the color, start from there, and make it a little brighter along the edges, or we can make it darker, I think. Just a tad brighter. Just a tad brighter along those edges, or would it make sense to have it darker? So what if we brighten up the base color? We can see what that looks like. Yeah, I think it makes sense to make the base color just a little brighter. Bring the light over here and see what we're working on. That may be a little too bright. We want it to be subtle. Subtlety is the way to go. Okay, that's looking good. So I noticed that there was this weird white bleeding around the grip, and I'm going to show you how to fix that. So come back into Bake Mesh Maps, and then we're going to bake everything again besides the ambient occlusion. Make sure you don't have use low poly meshes, high poly mesh checked. Ignore backface and then match by mesh name. And then make sure the suffixes are how we had them set up in Blender. So mine was underscore low poly to underscore high poly. And then we're going to bake again. And that should remove that bleeding effect. I didn't notice that before until we had the materials on there. So that was my bad, but it's an easy fix. Let's go ahead and let this bake and I'll be back with you. Beautiful. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. The problem is gone. Looking so much better. All right, where were we? Let's come into the grip here and under the base color. First of all, I'm not a big fan of this red that we were working on. Let's change the base color to, I'm thinking more of a black. And the curvature, can bring that down to be an even darker black. Now let's come into the grip, and I want to change the wood color to be more of a cherry wood or a reddish color. Really liking reds today for some reason. It's a little too intense. Let's desaturate that. No, not desaturate, but move the color slider a little bit. Something about like that I think looks good. Let's maybe add in some scratches to the grip. I don't know if leather can exactly take scratches, and this may not look good, but let's experiment with something here just for the fun of it. Let's add this above all the grunge passes. Okay, sorry, I wanted to add that on the wrap, not the wood. So let's add the fill layer up here, move it to the top, move it below the AO cavity and the curvature. And we'll pick a color about like that. We'll call this scratches. We don't want to mess with anything besides the color, the roughness, and the height. Let's decrease the height a little bit and then add a black mask. And then add a generator. And this can be some metal edge wear as well. I don't know if this will look good. Oh, you know, I actually kind of like that. I think it adds something. I think we have something interesting here we can play with. Let's move that above the curvature, above the AO cavity. Okay, that doesn't change anything. Let's move it up here and then mess around with this generator a little bit. Maybe bring the wear level down. Play with the contrast Yeah, bring the contrast down. We want it to kind of fade into it. It gets it this more worn look. I'm kind of digging it. Yeah. Increase the scale. Increase the scale so the details are smaller. Curvature weight, we can put that about 0.77, 0.75. Oh yeah, that adds a lot. Now that I'm adding in these details, I'm not a fan of the color of the wood. So I changed it for no reason, really. Let's come back in and tweak that one more time. It's a lot of playing around, and I mean, this is probably the most artistic part of the process, where you have really a lot of freedom just to experiment around with different looks. Yeah, I'm liking more the color we had in the beginning there. Man, that looks good. I'm happy with this. I'm happy with this. Let's see. Just kind of looking over the model, seeing what could be better. I think this kind of comes off as an empty spot, unused. Could really be better, so let's go into the guards, and where we had the engravings, how about we see if we have any alphas that would look good in here. Let's see what Substance Painter has for us. Okay, so I found this medieval, what is this, medieval spiral here, and we can rotate it by holding in left control and then left mouse up and down, and then right mouse up and down. We can scale it. I think that looks kind of cool. It may work. So let's fit it in here. About right there. I think that looks cool. So let's not change the scale like I just did. Let's add that one back in so the scales are the same. Scale it down just a little bit more. Pop that in there and then rotate it. We can also come in here to rotate it. If we bring this up exactly 270 degrees, sweet. Pop that in there. I don't know, now that I see it, I'm not crazy about it, so I'll remove that. Go look for something else. Alright, so I ended up going with the other medieval spirals and then just simply adding in the other engraving on either side. I think that kind of plays off one another, big, little, or big, little. I don't know which symbol means what, to be honest, but I think that's looking cool. So we got either music or harmony on the other side. The big, little, it's got some cool engravings on it. Yeah, I think for me, this is about pretty much done with the texturing process. Feel free to keep playing around with it and do what you want. I'm liking the look of the blade. So I'm going to go ahead and save it, which Substance Painter, at least on my machine, tends to take a while to do that. Alright, now we can go ahead and come up to File and Export Textures whenever we're done. For padding, do no padding pass-through, and then navigate to where you want to save this to. So I'm going to go to Udemy, Katana course. I'll call this, create a folder called Textures. Come in here and select that folder and export. And it'll export a base color, metallic, roughness, normal, height, emissive, normal, open, GL, and mixed AO. We don't have anything in our emissive value because I turned on that channel but didn't do anything with it. So if you have anything, you can use that later. But if not, I mean, you can just turn off that channel setting if you don't want one of those maps generated. Also, we have a bunch of settings here, output templates. If you're taking this to Unreal or Unity or whatever, Sketchfab, there's a ton of presets in here. You know, feel free to look around and experiment with different output settings. But for me, that's about it. In the next video, we're going to be going over to Blender to apply these materials. I will see you in the next one. Welcome back to the final chapter of this course. I do hope you have learned something and enjoyed it. In this chapter, we're going to be applying the material in Blender. So in the low poly, let's go ahead and apply all the modifiers we have remaining. And Control A, and it's helpful before you do this to have a backup, either a different save file or just copy or duplicate these assets into a different collection. Then press Ctrl-J to join them together. Let me turn my screencast keys on, come in here to shading, and then in your material, with the Node Wrangler add-on that you've hopefully enabled by now, press Ctrl-Shift-T, and then navigate to wherever you save those textures to, and bring in all of them besides emissive and then normal. We're using the normal OpenGL, and you can tell because the file size is much larger. So bring those in, and Node Wrangler will automatically set them up. And then in the material preview, we can see there's some weird stuff going on here. Let's shade flat. Shade smooth. And turn on auto smooth. There we go. You shouldn't have those problems when you import it into Unreal or wherever. But our materials are in, and it's looking snazzy. So now, I mean, it's ready to import it into Unreal Engine, Unity, Godot, your game engine of choice. Our total vert count is 3,551, and our tries are 6,670, which is excellent. I mean, that is a great game asset. Everything's looking really good. I'm happy with it. I hope you learned something. I've enjoyed having you here, even though I've really only been talking to myself this whole time. So, yeah, this is where we part ways. If you have any questions, ask away. If you've completed this course, show me what you did. Post about it. Link me to it. Post it in the review this course. Just share your work that you've created through watching this. And if I make any more courses, I hope you join me on those adventures as well. This has been my first Udemy course, my first foray into making something this expansive. I have a few YouTube tutorials, but those are typically no longer than 10 minutes and just talking about a process instead of showing you every step of the way, which has proven to me to be a bigger challenge than I thought it would be, but also pretty rewarding. So again, I hope you've enjoyed. Have a great day. Good luck with your Katana. Good luck with your game and your future ventures as a 3D artist.